Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's introduction of the podcast. It was a really interesting conversation with Megan Gorman, who is a financial manager, consultant to some of the wealthiest people in the country, and of course celebrities too. And she has a book called All the President's Money: How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money. And we concentrated on the first few, especially my man Thomas Jefferson, who so woefully mismanaged his money that it would be funny if it weren't also horrible, because he died insolvent. He died, in fact, millions in debt by today's currency. Megan was saying some people just don't want to face their economic issues, and so they compound the problem. And Jefferson certainly was that person, perennial optimist. I call him Mr. Magoo in this respect. But Jefferson could not manage money, but he lived beyond his means all of his life, and he never got on top of it. And it wasn't all his fault, but it was largely his fault. We didn't pension our presidents then. And so, fascinating, and I can't wait to meet her. I'm going to try to bring her out to Vail for a conversation. I think it would be a spectacular evening, because Gerald Ford, one of her favorites, has a special place in Vail life. I go there 4 times a year, as I think you know, going soon in August 24th or so for 4 days. And I always love it. We're talking about healthcare, but I'm doing a performance as Theodore Roosevelt, who comes up in this conversation. Edith, his wife, gave him $20 every morning and said, I will expect an accounting. And at the end of the day, she'd ask him and say, I don't know. It's gone. That's all I can tell you. So that's where we are. Now, today, I am looking out my window at a few little campers, a road trek. Oh, they're beautiful. They're the van size, and a Lance trailer. I had a Lance truck camper for a year before I went into the Airstream world. It's been a long, crazy, wonderful, exhausting, joyful, adventurous summer, and it ain't over yet. I love these programs where we get to go back to Jefferson. A number of people said they miss the old Thomas Jefferson hour. I do too. And I try to bring Jefferson back in from time to time because I'm fascinated by him, and I also think he's the most important American, more important in some respects even than Abraham Lincoln. But for the moment, let's go to the program. Join the Friends group. We're going to have another of our book sessions on Lewis and Clark Day by Day. That'll be the second of 2. You can watch the first one on our recording. Then we're going to move on to Edward S. Curtis, Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher by Timothy Egan. We're going to move on to Fool's Crow by James Welch, the great Blackfoot, Montana novelist and essayist. It's all good. And then we're going to talk about the Colorado River and John Wesley Powell. So it's a year of exploration, and the books are all chosen to talk about the West and America's frontier experience, including, of course, the dispossession of Native Americans. So let's go to the show. Thanks for being friends to this program. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I have the great joy today to be talking with Megan Gorman, who is the author of a new book, All the President's Money: How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money. Welcome, Megan.
Clay, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be here.
When I heard you, I think it was on POTUS a couple of weeks ago, I just thought, I've got to talk with her because first of all, there are angle books like Presidential Pets and Presidential Hobbies. This is an important one. This is a really important one about how people who have been president of the United States have handled their money. And of course, we'll get to in the third segment, we'll get to the problem of today when handling money has just blown the whole Constitution out of the water. But that's an outlier, I think. I was particularly excited to talk with you because, of course, Thomas Jefferson, my hero, my sense is that he may have been the worst money manager of all American presidents.
Yeah, I got to say, Jefferson and his buddies, Madison and Monroe, these are not guys you want to emulate in terms of how to manage your money. But I do think what's really fascinating about Jefferson and all of the presidents is when you start to get into people's personal finances, you start to learn who they really are as people. And that's what I came to love about studying this, because particularly presidents like George Washington, right? Thomas Jefferson, they're sort of built out of stone for us today. And yet, when you start to go into what they're spending money on, what they're struggling with, they start to feel like they could be alive today and that they're living with the same issues that we have today. And it's just a very humanizing thing to see. It's funny that you bring up Jefferson out of the gate because I always find it so interesting. Jefferson and Washington are sort of the two ends of the spectrum. So on one side we have Thomas Jefferson. When you start to look at him financially, he does everything wrong out of the gate. And in my book I talk about this because I work with wealthy people and I notice a lot of the traits that they have. And for anyone who works with someone like me, a wealth manager, tax attorney, we're often asking you questions, right? Trying to understand your mindset. And when you think about Jefferson, this is someone who is changing the world, yet having a hell of a time doing it. And you look at someone like him and you think about influencers today or celebrities today. Like I look at celebrities and I'm like, how do they actually afford that? They probably don't. And that's a little bit of Jefferson. He struggles with connecting with who his future self is, who he is working towards, who's he saving money for, who's he trying to manage his assets for appropriately.
Indeed. And so I like your approach to this, and say a little bit more about Washington and Jefferson as early bookends of the whole thing.
Right. So, in finish and just sort of touching on Jefferson, Jefferson out of the gate runs into a lot of problems and he makes decisions that makes his future life really, really difficult. And Jefferson really gets into initial trouble in the early 1770s. And he basically inherits from his father in law land, slaves, and debt.
Debt.
Debt. And this is a new country. It's at this point, it's not even a new country. It's not even a country yet. And Jefferson tries to figure out how to manage this debt. And of course, when he goes and deals with the debt holders, the currency's being devalued, they're refusing to take the money. And so this sort of starts off a spiral. Now, a lot of people would try to solve for it. And there are tools to solve for it. And I want to go to Washington on this. One of the things that Washington was very good at, but Jefferson wasn't, was Washington was an amazing budgeter. Now we talk about budgeting today, Clay. I'm sure people talk to you. Do you budget? Do you map out your expenses? And budgeting is incredibly boring. You have to be into the weeds. You have to do it daily. It's not fun. But Washington was an amazing budgeter. And of course, we have many of his budgets saved. And why his budgets are so important is budgets allow for problem solving. So Washington didn't inherit land like Jefferson did, but Washington built his land. He was a surveyor. He learns how to survey from his neighbors, the Fairfaxes. And Washington's an ambitious young man because he didn't inherit. His brother inherited everything from their father, and his father didn't even pay for him to go to college. And so Washington makes these diligent budgets, and he's tracking everything from, you know, carrots he's buying to carriages and so on. But what that allows him to do is as he's buying land, he's building illiquid assets. He marries Martha Custis and takes over her dowry and again has more illiquid assets. But by using his budgets, what he's able to do is he's forcing himself to make tough decisions. And in those tough decisions, he's doing things like selling property. And what's really interesting is, there's letters of Washington. Like we have a letter from him from 1787, and he's looking to sell land in the New Jersey area for about New Jersey, Pennsylvania area, about 1,400 acres. And the gentleman who's trying to buy the land from him wants to give him certificates, gold certificates. Because back then, currency was wild, right? We had dollars, we had pounds, we had pesos, people were trading in assets. And Washington refuses to take certificates for the land he's selling. And probably twofold. One, the certificates were not always a sure thing. But two, he's very clear in his response. I need the cash. And so, what you see with Washington again and again is using these budgets to problem solve. Jefferson starts budgets, stops doing it. He never really commits to it. And so, therefore, he's never able to sort of record on paper where he's at and make decisions. And that's what's really striking between these two men is similar asset bases, similar problems, and yet solve for them so differently.
So George Washington is not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's the lesser brother, doesn't have any real access. It's still a time of primogeniture. He joins the militia in Virginia and tries to get his way into the British Army. Fortunately, the British rejected him. He goes on to become the commander in chief of the United States. And then the rap on him is always, well, then he became a wealthy man. He managed his money really beautifully. He wrote these stern letters to his overseers all the time. While he's president, he's at the Constitutional Convention. He's still micromanaging his estate back at Mount Vernon. He knows where every penny is, and he hates waste, and he invests wisely in properties in the Ohio Valley. He does everything right, doesn't he?
He does everything right up until the end. One of the most interesting things about Washington is because he had become so astute with money, he was often asked to serve as executor for other estates. And this was, I mean, these are hard jobs. Being an executor today is a miserable job. And so he learned how to write legal documents. Washington wrote his own estate plan. And I talk about this in the book, but Washington, like all the founders, does struggle with this idea of slavery. And he drafts two estate plans which of course is a danger in its own, right? Because you shouldn't have two estate plans there. But when he gets sick that day in 1799, he does ask Martha to bring the two wills to him. And he looks at them, he throws one into the fire, and the other stands. And what's interesting about the will that stands is he makes a drafting error. And when you're drafting estate plans and you're thinking about the flow of funds, I always like to read things out loud. I like to think about how's this actually going to play out in different situations. And for some reason, he doesn't do this, but basically, he says, when Martha passes, the slaves are freed, which he reads it as he's freeing them. Of course, it's George Washington. His will is published in the paper all around the world. And of course, the slaves interpret something different, which is once she's dead, we have our freedom. And so this causes tremendous stress for Martha as a widow. You know, it's interesting. There's this great letter Abigail Adams wrote to a friend. Abigail Adams goes down to see Martha Washington, and the Adams are very staunchly anti slavery. And she finds Martha in a state, stressed. What she says in the letter is, Martha fears for her life. And so she's going to be signing a writ of manumission. And as a result, Martha will free the slaves earlier before her death. And if you go to Mount Vernon today, there is a sign on one of the routes that say there was a fire on the property after Washington's death. And they believe that fire was set as a way of being threatening towards Martha because of the will. And so this is an incredibly stressful period of time. So Washington, as amazing as of money, he does make a drafting error. But his estate plan lives for 50 years. There's actually a book on his estate plan. It's so complex and he's really amazing. And so when people ask me, who's the wealthiest president? Is it Trump? Is it FDR? No, if we present value all the dollars, it's Washington.
Just to make sure everyone understood what you just said, because he made this will in which his enslaved people would be freed after the death of his wife, Martha, whenever that might be.
Yeah.
Suddenly there's an incentive for his enslaved people, if they wish to terminate her life, to bring
Correct.
about that manumission. And so this is a problem right out of the heart of all the paradoxes of slavery.
And you see this again and again with a lot of these estate plans. You see it with Thomas Jefferson. George Washington was the model. Jefferson, not so much. We think of Monticello today as beautiful, right? And we're very lucky that it got in the right hands to be preserved. But at the end of Jefferson's life, it was falling into disrepair. He did not have liquidity. And you see it in the letters. Everybody's tiptoeing around it, right? All these issues with him. And Jefferson decides to put the house up in a lottery. And in the Saturday night Evening Post, you see the advertisement to buy lottery tickets to win potentially Monticello. And people do come in and step in and say, look, Thomas, not the wisest idea. We'll find a way to help you. They don't really help him. And so when he dies, his estate plan is really interesting. It's very, very focused on creditor protection, which is something we do today in estate planning. He wants to put things in trust for the benefit of his daughter, because if something's in a trust, the trust has a special shield around it where creditors can't attack it. one of the things that happens when he dies is Monticello does go up for auction. And one of the repercussions of this is his slaves also go up for auction. And you have slave families who had been on the property for generations, split up and divided. It's really heartbreaking. It's one of the slaves wrote a book on it years later about how tragic this was for all of them. And so there is this sort of long-term repercussion with money.
And we need to take a short break. This is fascinating. I'm talking to Megan Gorman. It's a Monday morning. I'm out in the American West. You are in New Jersey. The book is All the President's Money, How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money. We'll take a short break. When we come back, I want to dig in a little bit more about the paradox of Thomas Jefferson. Stay tuned, everyone. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Clay Jenkinson, talking with Megan Gorman, All the President's Money. What a great title and a really important book. Let's quickly look at John Adams. So here's what I know about this. Of course, he was infinitely more frugal than Jefferson. He lived quietly on his farm up in Massachusetts. He didn't buy the best wines and the best books and the best scientific instruments and the extravagance that's at the center of Jefferson's life. He had to live a more modest life. And of course, back then, you'll be the first to remind us, when presidents left, there were no pensions. There was no way to support them after that. They were just go back to your life, whatever it was. This is sort of the problem of being a small R republic. You don't want to aggrandize these people. So you think, well, they just go back to their lives. But you can never go back to your life, can you?
No, you can't. And John Adams, the interesting because we have John Adams and obviously his son, John Quincy Adams. And God bless John Quincy Adams for his diaries, right? He's given us a treasure trove. But one of the things that happens to John Adams over the course of his life is in the late 1700s, both John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, invest in a London based firm called Bird Savage Bird. And Bird Savage Bird was actually the banking house for the US government. So people felt safe investing with them, which is now it's sort of like back in 2008, 2009. If, who would have thought Bear Stearns and Lehman would be where they are, what happened to them? And so what ends up happening in 1803 is some of the checks that they're writing off of these accounts don't go through. And it turns out that basically this firm had been on precarious footing for years due to investment issues, due to, the British and the French fighting, and the firm goes under. And basically, John Quincy Adams has to break it to his father that he's lost, John Adams loses about $13,000. John Quincy Adams loses about $18,000. This is decimating.
This is a
And so
lot
I,
of money in today's terms.
is a lot of money. I mean, this is probably, close to this is hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is financially challenging because the Adams, like his compatriots, like Washington, like Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, owned a lot of land. And remember, the Adams had something that was very different. They were anti-slavery. They had to pay for people to work the land. So here we are, Adams is now leaving the presidency, and this sort of liquidity he was expecting is gone. So John Quincy Adams, I always feel, is like the Gen Xer of the early founding presidents, right? Because he's dealing with this. He's trying to help his father. He ends up selling some of his stocks and bonds to help his parents. He become reliant on him. And then, of course, his brothers are also challenging financially. So John Quincy Adams becomes this sort of he's the backstop for everybody. He's helping his parents. He ends up helping his brother Tom, manages his brother Tom's lands and put money into it, even though Tom's family will inherit the land. And then we fast forward, right before John Quincy Adams becomes president, he gets asked by somebody in his wife's family to invest in this investment called the Columbian Mills. And it's this area of land. And he doesn't really do his due diligence. It's a flour mill out in the area of Washington, D.C. called Rock Creek. And he invests in it about $32,000. And it is a money pit. and it fails miserably. In fact, they don't even sell it till like decades after John Quincy Adams is dead, and nobody ever made money on it. So this is he's paying for his parents, he's dealing with this. And then when he becomes president, he and Louisa start to spend. And so he's working himself up into this crazy financial situation. And then John Adams dies, and John Quincy Adams does something that's insane. He interprets his father's will in a very specific way. His father wanted them to keep the land, the mansion house and the land around it, but sell other things, sell the holdings, the books, and everything. John Quincy Adams takes it upon himself to buy from auction all of his parents' assets. And in order to do this, he takes on a ton of debt because there's all these beneficiaries of the John Adams estate. And this puts him in major financial peril. And so it's his son, Charles, who has to eventually come in and help his father budget and stick with things and sell off land. So, why I tell you this story is what I think is interesting is what you see is this constant struggle wherever you are in the United States during that time period. It doesn't matter if you're a Southern plantation owner or you own land in the North, there is an illiquidity crisis that goes on. And that's what causes so much tension for these presidents in their stress in their money life.
So it's moving to me to think that John Quincy Adams had to sort of bail out his parents to make sure they didn't become totally insolvent, and they managed to struggle their way through it. And we'll come back to Jefferson in just a minute because he's just so fascinating. But I do know that when Jefferson died, his grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, published 3 volumes of Jefferson's letters. And John Quincy read them, and marginalia, he hated Jefferson. He really disliked Jefferson, especially for the way Jefferson had treated his papa. But he says, after reading this, he says, it's just not okay that these great men, the author of the Declaration of Independence, my father, that they should die insolvent. This cannot be okay. We have to find a way to make sure that these heroes are at least financially stable when they leave the presidency. And I just think that shows you his character in a huge way.
It does. It does. And by the way, that issue doesn't get resolved till after Harry Truman leaves the White House. And, it's funny, I found in an old roll call of Jerry Ford's when he was a congressman, Jerry Ford voted against a presidential pension under this attitude of who are these people, like thinking they should get a pension. But this is a big issue over the course of presidential history because it's hard to imagine Barack Obama going back to practice law today, right? It just would be very, very difficult. But you bring up also post presidential life and the challenges. And one president who was one of our early presidents, so I think he has a very modern issue. And when I think of James Madison, I often think of Joe Biden. And I think about this in a very specific way because James Madison marries Dolly, his wife. She's younger than him. She's 17 years younger. He was older when he marries her. And when he marries her, her 2-year-old son comes into the marriage. Now, you know where I'm going with this, but it's one of these things where Payne Todd grew up in Philadelphia, and his father, his brother, his grandparents, his uncles are all killed in a yellow fever epidemic that hits. And so, what you see with James Madison and Dolly Madison is sort of an overindulgence of the child. And I bring up Joe Biden in the same way because when I look at some of Joe Biden's money issues, and I think about his life story and him losing his first wife and him taking over, raising Hunter and Beau, you see a lot of overindulgence there. And what you see over the course of Payne Todd's life is you see him getting put in positions where he'd be, if he works hard and is smart about it, could succeed. And what happens? He squanders it all. He's drinking, he's out with prostitutes, he's gambling, and he would run up debts, and James Madison would step in to help him. Now, why this ends up so tragic is, as I said, James Madison's older than Dolly, and he comes up with this plan at the end of his life as a way to sort of bolster up their finances that he's going to sell his papers back to Congress. And he wants like $100,000 for them. And, he ends up dying in the middle of this, and Dolly finishes the negotiation. I think she gets about 30,000. But her son continues to run up debt after debt after debt. So she's forced to sell, the family home. She's forced to go live with a cousin, and she's struggling the last parts of her life. And she ends up, when she dies, what's left of the estate is split between this cousin that she was living with and her son. And her son, who is such a ne'er to good, he still harasses the cousin and tries to undo the estate so that he gets everything left. And so I think about James Madison all the time, and I think about addiction and what we see today in the United States and with families trying to manage kids who are struggling. And it's really hard. You see that these presidents, even though they lived 250 years ago, have some of the same issues we have today. And so I have a lot of compassion for James Madison because I think he wanted to do the right thing by his stepson, but he just didn't say no enough.
Yeah, it's going to sound glib what I'm saying, but you're making it clear that it's also sad and sometimes tragic. But there's always a Payne Todd, there's always a Hunter Biden, there's always a Billy Carter.
Hmm.
That families are families, and there are young people who get their act together and lead responsible lives and contribute to the net worth of the family. And then there are others that just drain it, and there's nothing you can do about it. You just kept paying their bills. I think of John Adams. His son Charles dies of alcoholism as a young man. These are human beings, and they have all these issues. And of course, so now let's turn to the great one himself, Jefferson. It's just so complicated, isn't it? I mean, just this is one of the greatest. You could write the book on Jefferson's finances alone. There is one called Principal and Interest, which was
Yes.
venerable, older, not particularly fascinating book, but let's just set the scene. Jefferson inherits some land from his father and I think 52 enslaved people.
Yep.
And he marries this widow, a lovely woman, and she brings 134 enslaved
Yep.
people to the
Yep.
marriage, but enormous debt. And of course, these Virginians always think there's more land, it'll all get better, we just keep moving, land is wealth. But Jefferson is really never able to dig himself out from under this. He might have if he had been George Washington, but because he's Thomas Jefferson, he somehow lets that debt eventually eat him.
But here's the thing about Jefferson, right? If Jefferson was alive today, he would hire someone like me, right?
Right.
And this is where, some of the struggles was finding overseers who could do the job at that level. These men ran enterprises. You look at how much land, managing this land is hard enough. Managing all those people and then layer in financial crisis, bad crops. It was I mean, this would really be a 24/7 job. I think of my Fortune 500 CEOs. You need that type of person to be able to manage it, or you find someone to do it. Jefferson needed a family office, right? And probably he should have shared a family office with Madison and Monroe because they all were sort of in it together. And one of my favorite stories about Jefferson is he convinced James Monroe to buy a tract of land next to him because they wanted to retire together. And I was like, oh my God, how cute are they? They wanted to be in their assisted living together, right? Jefferson makes choices to not engage. And where you see this is not the record, because he doesn't keep great records, but they keep records on the food that they buy in the White House. And you see him overspending out of the gate, just even on the food choices he's making, on the wine, the cheeses. And there's almost with Jefferson, I've always tried to understand, like, why did he make these choices being so smart? And I think he just assumed I would deal with it tomorrow. And this is a very common technique when you work with people with money. What you're watching is when they move into crisis, do they ostrich? Do they bury their head in the sand? And Jefferson did a lot of that. And I think probably the behaviors that allow us to succeed 80% of the time can often undo us 20% of the time. You see that with Jefferson. And what I see when I look at the presidents is a lot of times there's a lot of repeatable behaviors. Donald Trump is a good example of repeatable behaviors in financial situations. He's always looking to get paid to go away, regardless of what's going on around him. And this, I grew up near Atlantic City. Atlantic City is a great example of that with Trump. So with Jefferson, you're seeing the spending and almost being an honorable gentleman about it, but he's not able to engage. And that's what the challenge is. But what I found in doing my book tour is this has actually made people like him more. They actually, because he's got a little imperfection in him. It's people are like, wow, he couldn't do money, and I feel like I struggle with money. It feels like something to connect with. That doesn't mean Jefferson didn't give advice to people about how to manage money. You go to the gift shop at Monticello, you can buy some of his adages about how to handle your money. But he was very challenged, and so That's probably the struggle of the legacy of Jefferson. But again, we benefited from his strengths.
Indeed. So you're probably too young to remember Mr. Magoo.
Of course, of course.
I always see Jefferson as Mr. Magoo, kind of blindly going
Yes.
through life, ordering more books. And if you read the previous book, Principle and Interest, every 6 or 7 years, Jefferson would wake up one morning and think, "Oh no, I'm broke,"
Right,
and
right.
then he'd say, "I'm going to never do this. I'm going to get things in order." And then, like 3 weeks later, he'd be ordering wine from France and more books, and he just couldn't help himself. It's a character issue with Jefferson, and you nailed it, Megan, when you said it's going to be better next week, or it's going to get better, because that's how he felt about slavery, that it somehow magically would disappear from American life.
Right.
That's how he felt about American Indians, that they would somehow magically get out of the way of American settler development on the frontier, that somehow his finances would magically get better with better crops or better prices, or maybe he'd have a nail factory and that would save him, and so on. There's a kind of a Magoo-like optimism in Jefferson that plays out. We get Monticello, we get Poplar Forest, we get the Capitol at Richmond, we get the Louisiana Purchase, we get an amazing achievement in almost every respect. And here's the big paradox: thanks to Albert Gallatin, he managed the nation's money brilliantly.
Yes. Yes, it's funny because I get asked a lot, are their financial skills correlated to how to do how they ran the nation? And I always bring up Warren Harding because bad president, phenomenal with money. Jefferson, great president, bad with money. And I will tell you, I would give up all my financial savviness to be Thomas Jefferson. So, there's something to be said. But I also want to point something out. The first six presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams, all came from money, all came from land. But one of the things that I find fascinating is our seventh president, Andrew Jackson, and he's the beginning of a different type of wealth building with presidents. Jackson, as you know, father dies before he's born. His mother, that the land isn't that great that the father settles on. He loses his mother and brothers in the Revolutionary War, and he doesn't have anything. One of the most fascinating parts of him is he's self created. And what he does eventually becomes the inspiration for stories like Abraham Lincoln, for Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Bill Clinton, which is the poor boy sets off in the world and makes his way and builds a fortune. Now, in Jackson's case, there's a rumored story about him where when he, is young, he inherits 300 pounds from his grandfather in Ireland, and he gets it. He goes to Charleston, he gambles it all away, a little bit of lottery winner syndrome. But to really understand Jackson, you have to think about the US at the time. The war's over, 1794, 1795, and a young person coming out trying to make their way. Now he's an attorney, he acts as a trustee, but he wants to be an entrepreneur. What's more American than that? And so he decides to set up this store with his brother in law, and they're going to bring cargo down from Philadelphia. But in the meantime, like a lot of people today, and a lot of people did this during COVID, he's off buying land, right? He and a partner. And one of the big challenges in the late 1700s is title isn't clear. My clients today will say to me, "Why do I have to pay for title insurance when I'm buying a property?" And I'm like, "Because we never used to have this, and this is what caused all this drama." And so there was a lot of title disputes. The other thing that's interesting at that time period is when Jackson was out practicing law, he got paid in corn, and more likely he got paid in these notes, these land notes. And he used to joke, "Oh, if all the land was tied together, I would have been paid enough to have my own county here in Tennessee." Jackson gets into this land speculating, and then he gets played. You don't think of Jackson as a guy who gets played much, but he goes up to Philadelphia, and what's gone on is there's a lot of people speculating on land. We have tons of supply and no demand. And a man named David Allison convinces him to sell him the land. And he would give him this certificate that he backed, that Allison backs. And Jackson was willing to do that because he wanted to pay for cargo from Philadelphia down to Tennessee for his store. And of course, what happens? Allison defaults on the note, and you've got Jackson, struggling to figure it all out. And eventually he's being chased by creditors. He sells the store to pay it all off. And so when you look at the story of the presidents, Jackson is the first American president who built wealth and wasn't reliant on inheritance, and he became savvy.
So we need to take a break here. I'm talking to Megan Gorman, all the president's money, how the men who governed America governed their money. When I come back, I want to ask you one more Jefferson question, and then I want to move into the presidents later in American history. Stay tuned, everyone. This is a special edition of Listening to America. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkins. I'm sitting across virtually from Megan Gorman in New Jersey. I think at your parents.
I am at my mom's, yes, in southern New Jersey.
I can see it in the Zoom. I love the pandemic gave us this chance to sort of peer into people's world. And I mean no disrespect to your mother, but that does not look like your house in California will look.
It doesn't. But I do think it's really interesting that behind me is a piano.
Yes.
And as you may know, the piano started as a high-end piece of musical equipment that, Washington had a pianoforte, Jefferson, they all had these very fancy pianos, but pianos became democratized. And they are a symbol of the middle class, which is why Harry Truman, was a phenomenal piano player. Richard Nixon. I mean, these were guys who grew up poor, but their parents were rising and they paid for piano lessons.
So you are a famous money manager. You manage the money of some extraordinary people. So I'm going to put you in this position for a moment. So Thomas Jefferson comes to you around 1800. He's going to run for the presidency. He knows he's going to win this time. He says, help me sort this all out. Put me on a budget. Take all my debts and get them all consolidated in some way. Go through all of this and give me a plan, and then try to hold me to it if you can. Here's my thought about this, Megan. I don't think it would have worked. I think if Jefferson had lived within his means, there would be no Monticello. It would be a modest Virginia house, and a good one, beautiful, but it wouldn't be the whimsical thing that he plucked down several times and rebuilt. If Jefferson lived within his means, he wouldn't have a library of 7,000 volumes. If Jefferson lived within his means, he wouldn't have been able to be the first great wine connoisseur in American history. In other words, to be Jefferson, you have to be over budget, because he never had the money to pay for the stuff that he wanted from life. He wanted to live a certain way as kind of an Enlightenment scientist, but he never had the income to support it. So he just did it anyway.
Yeah, it's funny. If I worked with him, I would be like, Thomas, what are the top three priorities, right? Like, I can work around this.
Just three, he would say.
Yeah, exactly. But I would also maybe give him this piece of advice. And it's what George Washington did. It's what Abraham Lincoln does. It's, what Eisenhower does. It's what LBJ does. And I'd say, hey, Thomas, isn't there a nice, wealthy widow you could marry? Because that may solve your problems. Because that's what those guys did. They married up.
He would fire you at that point, because the thing about it is that Jefferson has all these character issues. Of course, slavery is the chief of them, but he has to see himself as a high-minded figure of the Enlightenment. The idea of marrying for money, even though it's like straight out of a Jane Austen novel, would strike him as betrayal of his beloved wife Martha, and betrayal of his standing, and so on. So do you think that, we didn't have money managers in quite the same way then? We did have factors and agents, but we didn't have people that do what you do. Do you think you could have saved him?
It's hard. I've worked at times, worked with people who have a lot of these issues. I think if you worked very hard and you had also a psychologist working with you, and you're laughing, right? So people in my role, oftentimes we're the ones who see the beginning of mental illness, because spending is often a sign of like bipolar disorder, and you have to know when to bring people in. So I think with Thomas Jefferson, I do think there needed to be some understanding of what was driving the behavior. Like, why did he not want to be present with the money? And I don't know if he'd ever open up that way. He's a sphinx, right? He's very hard to reach and get to. But I think you'd have to work with someone like me, someone with a psychology degree. And then I think it would be figuring out what pieces we could sell and what are the non-negotiables. And could we save him? Maybe not, but maybe we could have made it easier on him. Because one of the things that when John Quincy Adams was fighting with his son, Charles, because Charles wanted to take over for managing John Quincy Adams' money. Charles says to his father, you've been worrying for years. Like, let me help you eliminate some of the worry. And by the way, Quincy Adams fights him about this anyway. And eventually he acquiesces. And what he says later is, you're right, I was so worried about money. And I think for Jefferson, even if we made some subtle shifts, we could have made him maybe not have to worry about it so much and not be up at 2 a.m. in the morning wondering, am I going to lose this beautiful thing that I've built?
I think the way I would have recommended that you go after him is to say, look, your daughter is the center of your happiness. You have got to make sure that when you die, whenever that is, that she is going to be okay. That has to be you will acknowledge, Mr. Jefferson, that that is your priority. And I think he would have to say yes, whether he really felt it or not. And that might have made a difference. At least he might have carved out some of that immense wealth, because he was a very wealthy man, even at the time of his death, for his daughter and his grandchildren. When he turned over his plantation to his grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, in 1815, Jeff, as he was called, said, I'm not doing this unless I have complete control. And Jefferson did not like that idea, of course, because he had that gauzy view that it was all going to work out all right. But his grandson said, no, there's no way to make this thing liquid without some real sales here. And Jefferson reluctantly, as an old man, now yields. But as you know, I'm sure this is a mantra in your world. People wait too long to make the right fiscal decisions.
They do, and because they're scared, right? And you want to hold on to something. But I often wonder, what would a conversation have been like Thomas Jefferson and Jerry Ford? And I bring up Jerry Ford because Ford, as he wasn't a president for long. I think he was very disappointed to leave the presidency because he was just getting the hang of it. And they all say it takes a couple of years. And he's young when he leaves. He's like 61, 62. And he's like, what am I going to do? And he decides to, redevelop what happens in post presidential life, joining boards of companies. And, one of the things I think is interesting about that, if that path had been available for John Adams, for Thomas Jefferson, for James Monroe, for James Madison, would they been able to go out on a circuit and speak, right? And do the things that Ford set the precedent for, which every precedent afterwards has added to. It's a shame that they didn't have those options in a way. And again, I think the social mores of the time would not have found it acceptable. I mean, George Washington would have been apoplectic at the idea of probably doing the circuit and doing a speaking event and getting paid for it. But it would be an interesting debate between Jefferson and Ford over what is the right way to manage a post-presidential
You said
life.
George Washington and Jefferson and John Adams couldn't write books with $1 million advances. It was ungentlemanly to do such a thing. The idea of Jefferson or John Adams, well, maybe Adams, Jefferson or Washington going on the circuit saying, it's great to be here in Cincinnati, and they couldn't do anything but farm. All right, so they can't earn money. When did presidents start to get rich? Not from their money that they brought to the presidency, but from what happened afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to look really at Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant grows up poor, fails miserably for the first part of his life, and then, of course, becomes the brilliant Civil War general and becomes president. But when he leaves the White House, people are benefactors and want to support him and Julia. And he ends up becoming partner in a firm. Unbeknownst to him, is a Ponzi scheme, but he was getting money from that firm. And so when that goes bust and he's basically broke, God love Mark Twain. Grant decides he's going to write his memoirs. He's sick and he was going to sell them for a pittance. He's literally got the contract on the table, about to sign. And Mark Twain gets word of it, shows up and says, no, 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 let me handle this. And so Twain comes up with this concept that basically they're going to have people sell door to door Grant's memoirs. And this is a huge financial boon, but Grant does not live to see it. He dies 4 days after he finishes his memoirs. That famous picture. He's got the big blanket around him. He's dying, and he's still writing. But his wife Julia does, get all of this money from the book. So I would tell you, Grant starts it, but Eisenhower got the most sweetheart deal of them all because, as you know, Harry Truman revered Eisenhower, and so Eisenhower comes back from the war. Truman even offers to let him run in his spot. And Eisenhower's like, yeah, no thanks. But Eisenhower writes his memoirs. And Truman works with Congress to get a special exemption on the capital gains for Eisenhower's memoirs. And Eisenhower gets a really huge, amount of money and doesn't really pay tax on it. Fast forward, Truman writes his memoirs And the two of them did not get along. And he's expecting the same thing from now President Eisenhower. And of course, Eisenhower does nothing. And this makes Truman incredibly sour. Although I do love the fact that after Kennedy's funeral, the two of them did get together and sort of reconnect and bury all the hatchets. So those were the sort of big things that happened. What Jerry Ford did is he and Betty sold their memoirs together, and they were the first joint memoirs. So, Hillary, Michelle, Laura, they should all be very thankful for that, because the first lady started to get their due with Ford. But it evolves again and again. And it brings up this issue today, which is now we function on influencers and brands. And so we've always struggled with what should the president do with their money. LBJ put his assets in a blind trust. So did Jimmy Carter. So did Barack Obama. And they work out sometimes well, sometimes not so well. Now, when you're a brand, how do we contain presidential assets while they're in office, knowing because of Jerry Ford, they can monetize post presidency? And that's our big struggle today.
I want to ask you how we would fix this system. I believe that Donald Trump is not the new norm. I don't think that the presidents in 2028, 2032, and so on will necessarily manage their finances in the way that he does. But if you were called upon in a presidential commission to suggest ways to fix this problem, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I think first of all, you need an independent, third party family office structure. And I would staff it with the best of the best. I would call Jamie Dimon and David Solomon and say, give me one guy or gal, give me, build a family office that if you're the person elected, you're like, dude, I want to work with these people. They're amazing. And let them invest for the president and let them release reports annually of what the president's invested in. There's going to be some inherent conflicts of interest, but there's a difference between a conflict of interest because of how you're invested and pure grift. And we need to demarcate between the two. I think what bothers a lot of Americans today is that we've gone too extreme with what this presidency is doing. But look, the guy owns golf courses, he owns businesses. I would expect him to have some conflicts of interest. But if you said a third party was running it and the Trump family wasn't involved, I'd feel a lot better about it. And by the way, I would want someone to be actively managing their money. Donald Trump is doing a lot of the big estate planning techniques that wealthy families do across the country. A lot of the stuff he does is in compliance with the rules. But again, it's the transparency and the understanding that he's not involved in the day to day.
This is going to
And
take congressional action, right? We can't expect these people just to do this because it's the right thing to do.
well, you know what? I work with corporate CEOs and they do it because it's the right thing to do. They have to, right? And we need to treat these people, Congress people too. I work with CEOs. We're not allowed to buy and trade the company stock unless it's reported. There's a 10b5-1 plan. You got to be very careful when you work with corporate leaders. Same rules should apply to Congress because, again, because of the Jerry Ford rule, we know you can make money afterwards. We know you're getting a pension. You're not going to fail like being a congressperson coming out of Congress in 1830, where there's just not that opportunity set. We need to grow the system to work with where we're at today. It's okay if people make money, it just can't feel like it's unfair and that the conflict is too deep.
Agreed. I'm talking with Megan Gorman, All the President's Money, how the men who governed America governed their money. We're just about out of time. I want to ask you to talk about a couple of fun things here. So one is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize, gave the money away to a peace foundation. That's back when virtue still mattered.
Yeah.
His wife put him on a budget, gave him $20 every morning. At the end of the day, she asked him to account for it. Yeah, I don't know.
I love that Edith did that. And it's so Edith, right? Like she knew her man. She knew how to manage him. It's awesome, right?
So I love that story about him. What else did you find that just delighted you in doing this book?
Well, it's funny because his father's estate plan was put in the New York Times, and you can pull it up. And it's interesting because both Theodore and his brother Elliot were allowed to be their own trustees and be really involved with the money. His sisters, his mother, they were very restricted. And of course, he's at Harvard and he falls in love. And I love going through his diaries because he's spending like a madman. And he's wooing Alice Hathaway Lee and he's spending on jewelry and taking her out. He was out of control with the money. One of the reasons you love Theodore Roosevelt is he's exciting and larger than life. And the whole time I'm reading the diary, I'm thinking, oh my God, if I managed his money, he would stress me out. And of course, even when he's going to build Sagamore Hill, which originally was called Lee Home for the first wife, and he changes it, the original plans and the money he spent on architecture and what they were going to do, he didn't have a lot of restraint. And I think the thing is with him, you have to say, look, if you're going to do all this stuff in the public space, the money has to grow at a reasonable rate of return, and you have to actually live within your boundaries. And I think Edith was a great partner to him. One of the best ways to succeed at money is marrying the right person. She understood him fundamental. She let him be him, but she kept the family from ruin. And that's hard to do. And I give her a lot of credit for that. So, he just was, look, he would have, being Alice Hathaway Lee, she probably had a fabulous courtship. He was a lot of fun and he spent a lot of money. So, but that's Roosevelt for you. And that's why people love him. Because when I went through FDR's files, FDR is a typical wealthy guy. He's angel investing all over the place. I love a story about FDR where, when he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy, they asked him about his paycheck. He's like, oh, no, just give me cash. And then after a few months, Eleanor's like, where's your salary? We have like bills. And the fact that he told the story without any guile, like no self, like to him, it was like, that's how it works. Like, oh, wow, okay. So there's something, the characteristics that make us love these people, you see it in their money, and it's quite charming. It makes them so human. And I think it's like going back to what I said about George Washington. He's so hard to reach. And same thing with Thomas Jefferson, but their money makes them people and makes you like them because they're sort of in the same boat we are.
Well, it sounds like you had a lot of fun writing and researching this book, and now you've been able to speak around the country about it. And I think you probably are now a consultant in new ways because of it, because people realize the depth of your research, the accuracy of it, and your joy in all this. Just one last little bit about Theodore Roosevelt. He came out to my country, to Dakota, had a ranch there, two ranches there. And lost a gazillion dollars, lost 80 some $1,000. But he said, it's the best investment I ever made. So it's not just about cash, is it?
No, no. And I talk about it in the book, right? It's the black swan event, what happens, right? With the big freeze that happens that kills all the cattle and so on. But yeah, I mean, if he was sitting here today with us, he would have told, yeah, exactly. It was the best investment. It changed his life. It saved his life. I mean, he became who he was because of going out there. And, look, I mean, sometimes having a bad investment and learning from it or seeing where it moves you to means it is a good investment. It's not uncommon. It's about the pivot. Abraham Lincoln would probably tell us the same thing with some of the things he did. He invested in a store. His partner was an alcoholic. The store goes under. Lincoln has all this debt. He calls it, the national debt, and he works really hard to pay it off. But it teaches him about saving so that when he's president, he's taking every little bit of his paycheck and buying treasury notes at 6 and 7% yields. Good for Lincoln. Dies with $85,000, $2 million in today's money. So the mistakes teach you, and that's not a bad thing.
In spite of having one of the most impecunious wives in the history of presidents.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She was not good for making money. She was not. And, look, he had talked to her about what they were going to do post presidency, but she had told Mrs. Keckley, her dressmaker, that if he didn't win a second term, she was going to be in a world of trouble because he was going to find out about the debt. She was shopping. Here's what's weird about Lincoln. As much as he was an attorney, he knew he had this wife that spent, he didn't have an estate plan. And of course, Robert Todd Lincoln calls the Chief Justice of the United States in to come in and manage the estate and save the family. But Mary Todd only got a third because he died intestate.
I'm talking to Megan Gorman, the great book, All the President's Money, How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money. Thank you so much. I hope I get to meet you in person one of these days. It's been just a joyful conversation. How can people find out more besides buying your book?
Yeah, you can find me at allthepresidentsmoney.com, or I'm also available on LinkedIn, or you can email me at megan@thewealthintersection.com.
We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.